We've worked hard, banded together, fought for something, and made history many times. We've gotten this far because together we are tireless. Tireless doesn't mean we don't get tired. It means we help each other continue on. And knowing one voice is strong, but the power of thousands or millions is stronger. Tireless takes a stand together, and we won't rest until all of Canada is with us. We are the Tireless, and together we will achieve gender equality.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Andrea Gunraj, and I work with the Canadian Women's Foundation. For 30 years, the Canadian Women's Foundation has been Canada's public foundation for gender equality. We support diverse women, girls, and two-spirit, trans, and non-binary people to move out of poverty, out of violence, and into confidence and leadership. Today, we're joined from many different areas of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit land. I myself am joining you from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit. This territory is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Anishnaabe, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to peaceably care and share for the resources around the Great Lakes. This territory is also covered by Upper Canada treaties. We're really grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this territory, but we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. And of course, this has been an especially difficult time for residential school survivors, their families, and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities. Survivors have spoken to abuses that they faced in these institutions and a concerted need for investment in truth-finding. Over 139 residential schools operated in Canada between 1831 and 1996, with over 150,000 First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and community, and with 150,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children placed in them, as noted by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I think that it's really important for us to mention that the residential schools crisis line is available 24 hours a day for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their experience. And you can reach them at this number shown below on your screen. You can also find other supports listed on our website, canadianwomen.org, and I'll put it up on screen as well too. There was an article yesterday by one of our authors that we're going to feature today, Michelle Good. She wrote an article in the Toronto Star that said, "Imagine the terror of children. Non-Indigenous Canada, this is the time to raise your voices." So we're glad to be speaking to these incredible authors today and covering some of these issues. In this edition of the Tireless Readers Collective, we're really thrilled to be featuring the authors of two amazing books. Michelle Good, author of Five Little Indians, and Karen McBride, author of Crow Winter. Michelle Good is a Cree writer and member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years, she obtained a law degree and advocated for residential school survivors for over 14 years. Good earned a Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing at the University of British Columbia, while still practicing law and managing her own law firm. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies around Canada, and her poetry was featured on 2 lists of Canadian best-selling poetry in 2016 and 2017. Five Little Indians, her first novel, won the HarperCollins UBC Best Fiction Prize. Michelle now lives and writes in the southern interior of British Columbia. And Karen McBride is an Algonquin Anishnaabe writer from the Timiskaming First Nation in the territory that is now Quebec. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Music and English, a Bachelor of Education from the University of Ottawa, and a Master's of Arts in Creative Writing from the University of Toronto. She works as an elementary school teacher on her home reserve. Crow Winter is her first novel. Now, we'll just quickly note that if we run into any technical glitches, please stay with us. We'll be right back. If you see any links that don't look correct, don't look right, you just ignore them. Please don't click on them. They could be spam. And if you are interested in following or getting involved with the Canadian Women's Foundation, I'd encourage you to go to our website, canadianwomen.org. So now I'm going to bring on our host, President and CEO of the Canadian Women's Foundation, Paulette Sr., and our two featured authors.
Hello, Andrea. Thank you for that wonderful introduction to this event. And I am so pleased and honored to welcome Karen and Michelle. Welcome to you both. Thank you for taking the time out of your, what must be a tremendously busy time for you right now in your schedules as authors, but also in terms of the critical conversations happening in this country right now. That's much needed and certainly overdue. We're so glad to have both of you join us today to talk about your books. I'm excited to get into it with you. And, as you can imagine, I've got a few questions of my own, and then we're going to hopefully, before we end, be able to feature a question or two from the audience that's listening during the discussion. Then we'll hopefully be able to do that. So let's just get right into it. So both of you, the books that we're discussing today are your debut novels. And Michelle, you've been writing for a long time, and Karen, you've got such a compelling story to tell. So just so happy that that we're going to hear a little bit more about that today. So can you share? Maybe I'll start with Karen and then Michelle. Can you share why you were drawn to these particular stories, and where do they fit in your own life path that you've taken? So maybe you can just kick us off, Karen.
For sure. Well, first, it's really great to be here. I'm so excited to chat with you and with Michelle. It's super great way to spend the afternoon, I think. For me, Crow Winter was a story that I needed to get out. It's one that's really close to my heart because it was my way to reconcile my own grief after losing my father. At first, I really didn't know how to handle that influx of emotions that comes from losing a parent, and I just was completely lost and didn't know how to let that out. So after therapy, which was a great choice and I highly recommend to everyone who can get to it, I was able to sort of come to that conclusion that, like, hey, wait, I should probably put my skills as a writer into practice and see if I can get this story written down and potentially help someone else with their own grief and on their own healing journey. So Crow Winter sort of blossomed from that and from my desire to tell a story that was uniquely Algonquin Anishnaabe.
That's beautiful. Thank you. And I'm glad you were able to talk about the benefits of therapy that really got you to get something out of you so incredible like this book. So thank you. And
sure.
Michelle.
Well, I began working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18 years old. I had just aged out of foster care and was living in Vancouver right around the time that this book begins in the mid 70s. And, my mother, my grandmother, aunties, uncles, they all went to residential schools. And so virtually everybody that I was working with were either survivors or their siblings or parents or somebody was a survivor. So this whole impact, the ongoing impact of the harm suffered at residential school was just a part of my everyday life. And then when I decided that I was going to go to law school, I graduated and I went to a firm and I was asked if I would handle 5 residential school cases. And that was the start of the 14 years that I represented survivors in the various approaches to resolving claims against the federal government and the churches. And during that experience, during my life experiences generally, one of the things that I noticed so clearly, even when there was tremendous amount of information available through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through their hearings, through, the stories that were coming out of schools in litigation and so on, even though Canadians seemed to be aware of the fact that these abuses occurred, they clearly did not understand that these harms are something that continue to echo through the generations. Otherwise, they would be not asking that ubiquitous and hideous question, why can't they just get over it? And that was what I wanted my book to respond to. It's like to humanize the experience so that people could bond with some survivors in the form of my characters and perhaps understand why this continues to echo.
Wow. Well, it seems just so apropos that on the release of your book and what's happening in this country right now, like you're the right person to be talking to in terms of where Canada needs to be and the work that still needs to be done. So, Michelle, your book centers on 5 people who grew up attending the same residential school. So we'll just continue that. And they attended residential schools in BC. The novel strongly focuses on how the traumatic childhood experiences impact them as they move into childhood or from childhood into adulthood. So can you go on further to share why you focused on adult impacts particularly?
Again, I wanted to focus on the impacts because that's why people seem to fail to understand. They don't understand that the impact of trauma, of childhood trauma, is something that goes on for a long, long time. None of these kids were getting therapeutic interventions. They were leaving these schools without supports, without an education, a meaningful education anyway, other than being trained to be a domestic service or servant or a manual laborer. And so they were leaving with a tremendous burden of psychological injury. And that is what I tried to portray in terms of how their lives unfolded after they left the school, was to articulate, the nature of the harms in my own, outlining of the characters and how those harms might reasonably affect the trajectory of their lives.
Yes, when the TRC were having their gatherings in different parts of the country, I had the opportunity to attend 2 of them. And I remember at the time that there was significant mainstream media interest in Spotlight. And, how many years later, after the report with the calls to actions were released and so forth, we're not seeing that same kind of attention that was paid. So can you share your thoughts on the impact of this recent media coverage as more stories come to light? Do you think things will change, and how? So I'll start with you, Michelle, and then we'll go to Karen.
Well, I think that, for one thing, this isn't news and it shouldn't be news to anybody. It's not new. Indigenous people in these communities, both Kamloops and the Saskatchewan community, we've known about this for decades and even longer. The Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, the calls to action 71 through 76, come under the heading of missing children and burial information. And in 2015, Harper was Prime Minister at that time. Murray Sinclair and his fellow commissioners presented a budget request with these 6 calls to action to protect burial sites and to begin the process of hopefully identifying some of these kids and getting them home. And the federal government said no. But even prior to that, 1907, Dr. Peter Bryce, the chief medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs, did a complete review of the medical, health conditions in the residential schools, and reported back to Indian Affairs that if their intent had been to create a program for the successful transmission of tuberculosis, then the residential schools were it. the Department of Indian Affairs responded by saying that's not enough to stop us in our search for a final solution. And it was our esteemed, head superintendent of Indian Affairs who coined the term final solution before Hitler did. So it's not new. And, the government has resisted doing anything about this for over 100 years now. And, but what I'm hoping for is that non-Indigenous Canadians will stand up and will raise their voices with their elected officials and apply sufficient pressure that something finally is done about this.
And Karen, just interested in what you think. What is the change that we need, and how?
I think just echoing everything that Michelle said is that we need our allies to stand up and be present and raise their voices and enact that change that's necessary to attempt at reconciliation. It's never, I don't know if I believe in that word anymore. I think it's really hard to keep using it because it's sort of like lost all meaning, and I think continues to sort of devolve into something else. But yeah, I think right now it's just very much dependent on keeping this conversation going, and that it isn't just relying on Indigenous people to have this conversation, where we can't just have a one-sided conversation anymore.
Not at all. You can't reconcile with yourself when
exactly
it wasn't you that did all of this stuff.
As we already know, Michelle said, this is not news to us. We know, right. And I think the numbers are what are finally getting people's attention, and realizing that this isn't just some horrible magical thing that happened. It was real, and it continued in the form of the child welfare system and continues today.
That's absolutely right.
I heard you say the word reconciliation doesn't do it for you anymore. And today I was reflecting, I was thinking of everything that's, that we've had to look at during this pandemic, including where we're at today. And the word that makes more sense for me is reckoning. Because there's some seriousness about that, where it should bring you to your knees, kind of reckoning. And so that's what makes sense to me, because reconciliation, even though it's in the same family of word, it doesn't quite do it in terms of the times that we're at and what's needed. So thanks for saying that. And we can keep thinking about what words make sense in terms of what we need to be doing. So Karen, you've talked about how writing your book became a way of releasing grief after the passing of your dad. And you said in another interview, quote, it became a form of therapy that you mentioned earlier, except you don't always have someone asking the questions or the right questions to help you get to the realization. So can you talk a bit more about how writing has worked as a healing process, and how you hope to your book will impact others?
Well, I think real life is very much not predictable. And it isn't you can't really wrap up a lot of these little endings and the big endings as well. So when I was writing it, I knew I wanted to give Hazel more of that conclusive feeling in a way to her grief, and give her those moments that I wish I had. In particular, she finds a letter that's from her father to her mom that he says all the things that he probably wishes he could have said to Hazel and her brother. And of course, Nora, the mom. And we don't really have those things in real life. They don't just happen like they do in the movies. You don't get the chance. You don't find a letter hidden in a drawer. So that was a really important process in my own healing journey, was to give those little happier moments or happier endings to Hazel. And in the same way, when she gets to reunite with her father or speak with him, I'm not going to say I haven't dreamt about him or seen him in the spirit world here and there when I'm traveling, but it was important that Hazel got to do that too. So I think writing these feelings and these little scenarios really did help me, and hopefully, you know, help other people who connect with that sort of loss see that, like, we don't ever just we lose people, but they don't go far away.
I can attest to that. I've lost both my parents, and I can relate very strongly to what you're saying. And Michelle, can you add anything in terms of writing as a way of healing? Writing and reading as a way of healing?
Oh, absolutely. My son passed away during the writing of this book, and he was my only child. And there is one of the characters in my book, one of the male characters passes away, and there is a whole scenario about his journey to the other side. And that was based entirely on my experience with my son. And it was very, very healing for me to just articulate that in, you know, through my writing. It was a very healing thing. Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, Michelle, I'm going to continue with you if that's okay. Through your book, we see how your characters' experiences of childhood trauma manifest very differently in adulthood. Mm-hmm. So while some of the characters are able to recover and move forward with the support of their communities, others aren't. So based on your experience and that kind of sounds like real life too, and not the movies, as Karen said earlier. But based on your experience as an advocate for residential school survivors, how can we as a society do more or do better to support people to overcome trauma, to see through how the person expresses their trauma to the person struggling inside, and how we recognize our limitations as individuals in our ability to help and intervene? A big question, but it's all related.
It's a big question, but I think I got you.
Okay.
So, well, I think one of the most important things, and I'm thinking of this in light of, you know, the current media stories about the finding of these burial sites as well, is that non-Indigenous Canadians need to take responsibility for their own education. We have carried the weight of educating non-Indigenous people for so long, and it's really time for, well, it's past due for non-Indigenous people to, you know, begin their own journey of understanding, both in terms of factual information, but also in terms of understanding how these impacts affect us, not only as individuals, but collectively as well. Because these were not a failed educational venture, these residential schools. They were a key implement in the colonial toolkit. They were there designed to destroy us as a people. And if they weren't successful in terms of destroying us as a people, to destroy the culture that supported us and kept us whole and kept the fabric of our societies intact. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's the first thing is, you know, take responsibility for your own education, and then perhaps you will have the knowledge base inside you that you can find a deeper level of compassion and an ability to support people. Mm-hmm. And in terms of that, in terms of allyship, people need to use their privilege, not to, you know, try to run the show and do what they think is good for us, but to create room, to make room for Indigenous people so that we can articulate what needs to be done. So,
yeah, absolutely. Get that. It's, you know, do your own learning.
Well, you know, the burden has rested on our shoulders. Yes. And even now, I see, you know, fellow Indigenous people on Twitter, on social media, and so on, right? You know, saying, I'm exhausted from hearing from people saying, what should we do? What can we do?
We're losing you a little bit, but I know you'll come back in a second.
No, am I back yet?
Yes, you are.
Somebody now. Tell me. Okay, right. We carry the burden of what's been done to us. That's the weight that we carry on our shoulders every single day. We don't need the added weight of feeling a responsibility to educate non-Indigenous people and to tell what their role is. And in terms of reckoning versus reconciliation, I think reckoning is the truth part of reconciliation, okay? And, you know, Murray Sinclair has said this many, many, many times. There can be no reconciliation without truth. And that's what's starting here, is a reckoning with respect to these children, these graves that are being found on residential school sites. That's the reckoning. That's the truthfulness. And maybe
Absolutely.
if we can achieve a degree of truthfulness where everything that was done to us is acknowledged and accepted as truth, then we can move towards reconciliation, which I also see from a slightly, I mean, I'm tired of that word too, right? It's so frustrating because we're so far away from it, you know? And I see it from the perspective of the bookkeeping definition, right? Where you have your bank balance and your statement, and you have to make them balance, right? And that's how I see reconciliation, is that, you know, there must be a balance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in terms of resources across the board. And, you know, we hear about, oh, the rule of law, we have to follow the rule of law and all of this nonsense. You know, when it's the Wet'suwet'en people, oh, they're destroying the rule of law. They're not, you know, respecting the rule of law. But then on the other coast, we have the Mi'kmaq fishers, the lobster fishermen, whose boats and buildings are being burnt and attacked, they're being shot at on the ocean. And it was the Supreme Court of Canada that said that they were legally entitled to be fishing for a commercial purpose. So where is the emphasis on the rule of law then? And the RCMP standing back as people's lives are being threatened, doing nothing.
So, or having very friendly conversations.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we don't think this is a police matter.
Right,
you know, when people's lives are at stake because they're trying to function within the rule of law. So, but what I think is one of the key things that people, non-Indigenous people need to understand before reconciliation will be even a possible dream, is that the resources of this country need to be shared, and Indigenous people need to control their own resources. Land needs to go back to Indigenous people. If we are to be self-sustaining, if we are to be self-sufficient, then we need our rightful share to the resources of this country that have been stripped from us. And the whole colonial toolkit was about doing that. It was about wiping us off the land so that we could be replaced by settlers, and so the resources of the land could be exploited.
I want to say speak, but absolutely. And I like the way you framed reckoning, because reckoning is the what so, it's the what happened, you know? And so before we can come together and balance with each other, we need to tell the truth about what happened.
That's correct.
Right. So, so Karen, you said you wanted to show the reserve your book is set in as a real place and not as a made-up, scary, fictional land. It is rendered a place of community belonging, which is amazing. Can you talk more about how you brought experiences, conversations, relationships, like the imagination to life, and the food of reservation communities to life through your book?
Well, it was, I think, paramount for me to show the res that I know, and that I know First Nations people across the country know, and that it's home. It's not this fictional, scary land that is always perpetuated through the media, and any kind of coverage that's on a reserve is usually like, oh no, this horrible thing is happening. And then news outlets have to mute their comments on Indigenous articles. So there you go, in terms of understanding why we don't really want to talk about what's real out there. It's frustrating for all of us, right? Sorry if you can hear my dog bark in the background. Apparently he's back from his vacation early.
It's real life.
It's real life, exactly. He's actually just back from the Reds, so he can tell you all about how great it is. But I really wanted to showcase the community that we create, and that not just within our families or within the greater community at large, but with the land, and that loving ourselves comes from loving the land. And that's a really huge thing for the characters in my book, especially, is the connection to their homeland and to preserving it and protecting it and reclaiming it. And I think that's really, like Michelle said, at the heart of us coming into our own, is that we get, returned all of these amazing things and resources that do belong to us. And I think that's very much what it means to be from the Res, and what it is to be on the Res. It's this connection to community, and through love and laughter and all that good medicine, like you see, especially with my main character Hazel and her mom. They have such a fun back and forth, and it's just very much real life on the Res, and what it's like to have a family that loves each other.
What's coming to mind for me as you talk is, the idea of wholeness, like just becoming whole. And you said loving ourselves comes from loving the land. And so that land is the actual physical space, but also the love created in that space is part of that wholeness. So that's beautiful. In both your books, there are decolonizing themes about connection with the land, with animals, nature, and respecting Mother Earth. How does your connection with the land play a role in your lives today? And how do you think we all need to connect, particularly at a time when we might feel more disconnected than ever, especially now? So, Michelle, perhaps I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Karen.
In Christian ideology, and I got nothing against Christians, let's be clear about that. but when we look at that Bible, and and the Bible was written by humans, and there's several different versions, but there is a statement, and I can't remember. I think it's Genesis. It's the Old Testament anyway, and where it states that man shall have dominion over the earth. Right. And dominion is like sovereignty. It's like control over the earth. And that is just a profound difference from an Indigenous perspective of our relationship with the earth. We are of the earth. We don't control the earth. Everything, we acknowledge that we are the only creatures that the earth does not need, and that everything that grows, that walks, that flies, that swims has been placed here for our use, right? But as a gift from creation. And so we need to acknowledge our place on an equal footing with everything that grows, walks, swims, flies. And it is the disconnect from the earth that we see in modern society that makes it okay to kill wantonly, to kill the earth wantonly, to kill animals wantonly, to interfere with ecosystems because it's more financially beneficial. It sets a whole different sense of priorities than if you see yourself at the bottom of the food chain instead of at the top of the food chain. And and we see ourselves as being, very vulnerable, but gifted with all of this incredible stuff, with all of the incredible powers of the earth. And that's something that I tried to portray in the novel, in terms of Clara finally, one of my characters finally finding peace through traditional ceremonies by being on the land with Mariah, the healer that she was connected with. Yeah.
Great. Michelle? I'm sorry, Karen?
No, go again, Michelle. Please keep talking.
No, Karen.
I could keep listening to both of you, but yes.
Well, I think just to again echo what Michelle's saying, my characters find themselves by connecting to land and through culture, and it's such a pivotal moment for Hazel when she goes to her first sweat.
Mhm.
And I think for myself, like when I intend to sweat, I feel so very much rooted in who I am as an Indigenous person, but also who I am within that whole cycle and in that circle, because you are, you know, it's like you're in the earth and a part of it, and respecting all of the things that come with that is so important and vital to our success as people. Is, you know, remembering that these are our brothers and sisters, no matter if they're if they've got wings or legs or they're swimming. It's there is no other way, right? There shouldn't be another way. Otherwise, we're going to end up in some kind of deficit. And that whole idea of like economic growth versus preservation for the future is huge in Crow Winter, and I think is something that I think of as being super important to me as well. There's a quarry in my book that could potentially offer all kinds of jobs to the community and have economic growth for, I don't know, 5-10 years, but then what? All of that resource is gone, and we lost this important special and ceremony site, and the potential for all of that cultural growth is gone if we continue to exploit that kind of resource. So I think knowing our place within that big circle is vital.
Mm-hmm. You know what you're both talking about is such an important message right now to where we are, not just in Canada but globally, in terms of this constant struggle between you know, economic growth that seems to be nonstop and has no end, to you know, to looking after this earth that looks after us freely, you know. So it's such an important message, and thank you for such a beautiful way of explaining that, because I think sometimes we miss the point and we don't get it. And that's why right now is the time that all of these conversations need to be happening, all of them together, because we need to see it as one big picture. And that's part of the whole, in fact. So Karen, I'm going to continue with you, because throughout your book, Crow Winter, the main character builds a relationship with Nanabush. Am I saying that right? Nanabush?
Yep.
And who's depicted as a crow. So can you talk a bit about the importance of spiritual elements in your writing, in your authorship?
Well, I think if it wasn't obvious, I'm a little bit of a nerd, in case you can't see all of my junk behind me.
I've been noticing a few things, and they're interesting.
No. Oh my goodness, I know I should have blurted out, but no, I've always loved like magical stories and blending the real with the unreal. And then growing up and then hearing more and getting more teachings from elders and from community members, and learning that like Indigenous people, at least First Nation people, you know, our line isn't as starkly drawn as other cultures, between what's real and what's not real, or between the spirit world and our world, and that these are stories that just exist. They're just a way of life for us, you know, that we know that like that crow out there has a teaching for me, and that's why he's hanging out so much, and I have to be ready to accept it. And that might come in the form of a dream, or maybe it'll just happen automatically. But I think in terms of storytelling and expanding on that, to me, it's really important for us as Indigenous writers to create a fun sort of pantheon for the youth to come into and see themselves represented in super exciting, positive ways. And that's what I tried to do with Crow Winter, and probably what I'm going to do with my future writings is continue with that and just build and grow on that spiritual connection to the everyday and potentially to the mundane that's actually not mundane, and that there's beauty in absolutely everything and magic in everything.
Yes, and thank you for being such a nerd.
No problem.
Continue the nerdity. Great. So in both your books, there are characters who advocate for systemic change. Now, these are words that I've been saying for decades in terms of my work across the, gender equality sector. And so it's normal for these words to kind of just flow out of my mouth and the folks I work with. I'm hearing it now in all corners of this country as we've been shut down and having to think about what are solutions and what kinds of solutions are going to actually create systemic change. So in both your books, there are characters who advocate for Indigenous rights, systemic change, and justice in various ways. As storytellers, where do you think stories can play a role in advancing this kind of change that leads to the social change that we see? Michelle, do you want to go first?
Well, from my point of view, the way I look at the world, the whole world is a story, and sometimes in fiction, well, not sometimes, all the time in fiction, you have a much broader, I get a much broader leeway in terms of latitude, that's the word I'm looking for, in terms of the way you construct a story so that it will inspire thoughts about such things like systemic change and so on and so forth. And, there have been major works of fiction that have had tremendous impacts on people's consciousness, on their understanding, on their decision to take certain acts and so on and so forth. But, my sort of bugbear about systemic change is with the RCMP. And, for my people, the Cree people of the prairies in what was once called the Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, the RCMP came from the Northwest Mounted Police, which was a paramilitary force that was designed for the eradication of Indigenous people, for clearing us from the plains, so that non-Indigenous settlers could take over there. And until the institutions that were formed with colonialist objectives at the heart of the organization, until they can expunge those objectives, they can expunge the spirit of colonialism from their institutions, we're not going to see systemic change. And I think, I'll give you an example. It was in April. The RCMP in Saskatchewan tweeted a comment to honor 2 Northwest Mounted Police officers that were killed during the Troubles, during the resistance in in Saskatchewan during the time of Duck Lake, at the time of the Riel resistance.
Right.
And I thought, like, how tone deaf could you possibly be? Like, I think this was actually, I may have the date wrong, but it was right on the heels of the Colton Boushie report being finally issued. And it's like, what are you missing here? But those colonial foundations in government, in RCMP, in all of the major institutions of the country have to change. That has to change.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the word decolonizing is a word that's being used by many people who probably never actually thought about it before. But it is easier said than done. And how do you actually create systemic change when at the root of many institutions we're dealing with colonial beginnings, and continuation.
Well, I think we have to just be fearless and be prepared. When people talk about defunding the police and everybody thinks, what, you're not going to pay police officers anymore? It isn't that. It's about breaking down the roles that police are playing right now and spreading them out over appropriate disciplines instead of having them in the policing bundle, and funding them. And you're going to have a markedly different organization if you do those things. And, we just have to be courageous,
Yes. Yeah.
Bite the bullet, make the change.
And I think sometimes just apply some common sense, but let me not go on. Karen, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, I think with fiction, you have so much wiggle room to play with your message and to weave in some little subtle things here and there. And that's immensely exciting. Because when someone's picking up a book, they're already ready to be told a story. And you can just throw in all the truth in there and make it in a way that's perhaps more digestible for them. So I think that's really fun with fiction and any kind of storytelling or media that we're consuming now, right? Like we're getting, we have so much at our fingertips and at our disposal that this is the perfect place to plant those seeds of this systemic change and, you know, point people in that right direction and understanding what decolonizing actually means. And even something like letting our languages come back and letting them grow can happen just by throwing it in there and not explaining it. Like it's what I did with Crow Winter. I put Anishnaabe in the story and I put a glossary at the end. So if you're like completely lost, you know, pop in at the end and you'll see all the definitions of the words, but I didn't want to explain it throughout to be like, no, it's here, it's real, and I want you to experience it and live it. And I think that's one of the ways that we can do that with our writing and with our stories is bring those realities to the forefront. Right.
So just that kind of artistic freedom to do that because it is fiction, but it's also truth.
Exactly. It's pretty, it's made pretty or perhaps more intense depending on how you're telling it. Right.
One of my favorite sayings these days is that something need not be factual in order to be true.
Yes.
And fiction gives you, like you say, that leeway, the latitude to, I guess, condense that truth in a way that facts would limit you. With fiction, you're only limited by your ability to imagine and express, right? And that's a pretty good thing. The other thing that I found, or I believe too, is that readers are actually the other writer. As they read what you've written, you have no control once it's out there. You know, as people read what you've written, they're filling in the blanks themselves.
Absolutely.
And they're engaging with the information and, you know, hopefully learning, and they're filling in the blanks themselves. And hopefully that's something that will broaden their conception of the subject matter.
Exactly.
I was wondering, Karen, because before you referred to the fact that you're a nerd, and I'm seeing all kinds of things behind you, including a piano or a keyboard, a sword. A sword is as well. So how does all of that music and that kind of imaginative nerdom that you live in actually
it's a good way to describe it. Well, music is a huge part, I think, of who I am, even though I'm not necessarily very good at it. There was always music in my house growing up. My dad was a musician. He was in a band, and he actually bought me this keyboard, so it's really special to me. My undergrad is in music, so I mean, like,
there you go.
I've been attempting it for many years, but my principal instrument was actually saxophone. So I don't have that anymore because I wasn't good at that either. Hence why I'm a writer now. I don't have to perform in that way. But I think weaving all those things together really lends itself to world building for me. And I think being a big nerd that I am, has me really interested in world building with fiction. And it's such a fun thing to do and something I hope to do in the future with my writing and create something that's like monolith or huge, you know, like like Lord of the Rings style kind of thing, but native, you know. That would be the goal. And I don't know, Michelle, do you listen to music when you write, or are you a silence kind of writer?
I'm kind of a silent kind of writer because I love music too much. I'm also very much into music. I play the guitar and I've been singing all my life. I found my kindergarten report card. And my kindergarten teacher said that I was a very good student. I had a beautiful singing voice, and I talked too much.
And here you are.
Here I am, right? So I find it very difficult to write when there's music playing, because it pulls me in. It's never
takes your attention.
Yeah, like music is never background to me. It's always like I engage with it. And so, so I definitely write in a quiet space. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I always listen to music. I have typically it's instrumental because I want it to be atmospheric, and it really helps me create more of the situation I'm in. Yeah.
That's funny.
Oh, cool. So that was a question from the audience, and here's another one that you may that Karen is to you, because you mentioned earlier in your bio that you are indeed a teacher. So there's someone that's wondering what your students are reading and what the teens in your life are reading. So I don't know if you teach younger students or teens, but what are they up to? What are they reading?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not a teacher anymore.
Okay.
I need to update that bio. But I was a teacher. Yeah, I taught grade 7 and 8, and I taught grade 5 before. So I'm that junior intermediate level teaching.
Right.
If I was, though, I would have them reading David Robertson for sure.
Yes.
Do I have any of it nearby? I must. That Reckoner trilogy. It's the Native superhero.
Yeah.
Absolutely, they'd be reading that. Anything he writes is just amazing, and he's got such a huge collection. Just Google him, and you'll have this beautiful, huge resource or access to resources of amazing stories. Or Richard Van Camp, there's someone else who's just boom, 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 800 books. They're fantastic, and I highly recommend both of those gents. And of course, Cherie Dimoline's Marrow Thieves is fantastic. And if I was in a higher grade, I would be teaching Michelle's book.
Yeah.
My goodness, we'll be here forever if I keep going, though.
So we unfortunately we don't have forever, so we're going to wrap up in a couple minutes. But I think maybe what I'll ask both of you to wrap up with is to share with us something that you're working on now. So what's a project that's occupying your time and energy, and probably hopefully giving you energy?
Go ahead, Karen.
Oh gosh. I don't know if it's been the same for you, Michelle, but I've had such a hard time writing this past year, trying to do anything creative. It's been wah, wah, the whole time. But I am working on something new. It is a little bit more YA, which is where I think my heart is, having grown up with it, and it's just such a fun genre to write in. But it's a story of 4 kids on the res. I think it's a bit of an homage to my childhood in a way. Takes place over a summer, and there are spirits and magic and mystery and all of that good stuff that happens over the course of this summer, but also talks about a little bit heavier issues like the foster care system and chosen family and how we create our family.
I look forward to seeing that when it comes out. And what about you, Michelle?
I'm working on something. I have had a difficult time getting down to writing this year too, but it's because my time appears to be in demand right now. I appear to be a victim of my own success, so to speak. But the book that I'm working on right now is loosely based on my great-grandmother's story. She was born in 1856. I was born in 1956, and I just love that symmetry. It's really awesome. But the point of it is that she was about 18, 19, maybe even 20 before she ever even saw a non-Indigenous person. And so, in effect, we have this person who grew up with minimal colonial impact and then experiences the full force of colonial impact when the military, Northwest Mounted Police and such, became involved with the incident at Frog Lake and the Riel resistance and so on, and how her band, which was Big Bear's band, was chased across the border into Montana. And so I'm going to be writing that story from the perspective.
You're cutting out a little bit, but we're hoping you'll get it back.
I know, it's very suspense.
I know, it's just hanging.
Am I back yet? Am I back yet?
You are now, yes.
Okay. How far did I get on that? Sorry.
So you're going to be writing about that whole experience. I think you left off.
Okay, it's basically just from a point of view of a person who didn't experience colonialism through their developmental years, and then, to experience that. And it will be focusing on what was it that happened in history that made it acceptable to brutalize Indigenous women. Mm-hmm. And Winston Churchill once said, "Gentlemen, history will be kind to us because I intend to write it." And that's what we suffer from in Canada, is that the history of Canada is written through a colonial lens. So I'm going to be writing this book to write some history from an Indigenous lens.
Excellent. That's the place to end this conversation. And I've been very honored to meet you both, to have this time to share with you, to learn more about you. And I wish you the absolute best in your upcoming works, but also that as we journey along this path of reckoning and reconciling, that we'll be able to take what we've learned today, what we shared today with us in terms of the messages, and also just, be able to make right with all our relations as we move along. So thank you so much. Privileged to have met you.
It's lovely to see you, Karen.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Michelle Good and Karen McBride for taking their time to join us, two excellent authors with excellent books, and to our host, Paulette Sr., and all of you for joining. Just want to remind you that the Indian Residential Schools Crisis Line is available 24 hours a day for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their experience. Reach them at 1-866-925-4419. And you can find other resources available on our website. There's a listing of a few. It's not all the resources out there. It's just some to get you started and find something that is relevant to you. On top of all the incredible stuff that was mentioned today, all the books that you can read today, for those of us who are non-Indigenous, I'd really encourage you to check out this article Michelle Good wrote. Yesterday, it was published in the Star, called "Imagine the Terror of the Children, Non-Indigenous Canada. This is the time to raise your voices." I think this is really important for those of us who are non-Indigenous and have our learning to do. I'm really going to take away this beautiful conversation as a call to learn more, and to also not put the responsibility of that learning on anybody else but myself and my colleagues who can also help me learn, who are non-Indigenous, and we're all in that learning place. If you're interested in following, getting involved, or donating to the work of the Canadian Women's Foundation, you can visit our website at canadianwomen.org. And I'll put that up on screen so that you can check that out. I'd like to draw your attention to a couple of things that just happened recently. Just yesterday, we had a great webinar called Intention to Action, Supporting 2S LGBTQ+ Communities. And this webinar spoke to organizations leading the way on inclusion and doing incredible things to really model and show us what's the way that we can go forward, making sure that everybody's voices are included and people are supported and elevated, and that some liberation happens. 2S LGBTQ+ communities locally and nationally. So you can check that out on our YouTube channel, and there's the link down there. And I'd also like to mention that we have a new grant program open called Community Needs Grants. It's the new annual grant stream designed to meet 1 year of flexible funding needs to organizations that are addressing a lot of issues. You can find more and how you can apply if you're an organization that has a program that's relevant. You can find that information on our website, canadianwomen.org. And for those of you who entered the book draw, please stay tuned. We'll be reaching out to winners next week. And these books, of course, you can find them on a lot of different places. We'd encourage you to go to your local community bookstore to make sure that we're supporting our local booksellers. So just thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day, and happy reading.
We've worked hard and made history many times. We've gotten this far because together we are tireless. That doesn't mean we don't get tired. It means we help each other continue on. And knowing one voice is strong, but the power of thousands or millions is stronger. We are the tireless, and together we will achieve gender equality.